committee will come to order. Before we get started today, I want to take a moment to offer our committee's deepest condolences to all those impacted by yesterday's tragic shooting in Florida. Our hearts go out to all the victims and their loved ones. Please know you are in our prayers. Today, our committee is honored to welcome Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin to testify on President Trump's fiscal year 2019 budget proposals for the Treasury Department. Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your time and look forward to your testimony. Our committee's annual hearing with Treasury Secretary plays a key role in our work on behalf of the American people, and we have a lot of important work ahead of us. Mr. Secretary, when you were here last year, you told us your number one priority was economic growth for America. Then and now we share that priority, especially on tax reform. Last year, working together with you, with President Trump and the Senate, we successfully overhauled our nation's tax code for the first time in 31 years. With the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we now have a tax code that's specifically built for growth, to deliver more jobs, fair taxes, and bigger paychecks to Americans nationwide. With this law, families will be able to keep more of their hard-earned money to use as they see fit. In fact, a four-person family with no income tax under the new law until their income exceeds $61,000 will pay no income tax until their income exceeds $61,000. In my district back in Texas, a typical middle-income family of four, parents with two kids, will see a total tax cut of over $2,600. This is real money. It'll have a real impact for so many hardworking families. The benefits don't stop there. Since tax reform, utility companies are announcing lower rates. Businesses are announcing more jobs and new investments here in America. And our companies are bringing home money from overseas to invest in our communities and in our workers. As encouraging as this is, it's only the beginning. There are still a lot of benefits to come for workers and families across the country as this new tax code unleashes the growth of jobs and paychecks in our economy. At the same time, there's still more that we can do to advance tax reform. That's why today's hearing with you is so important. Looking ahead, we have a couple specific areas we are eager to discuss today. First, as we all know, there's no such thing as a perfect tax system. And where imperfections may exist in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we have responsibility to provide real workable solutions. We're taking this approach right now as it relates to Section 199A of the bill, which offers a first-ever 20% deduction for pass-through business income, incredibly important for our Main Street businesses, farmers, and ranchers. We know that certain parts of this provision are having unintended consequences for our farmers and our ranchers due to the treatments of farm co-ops. I'm committed to working with our Ways and Means members, with Senator Hatch and the Senate Finance Committee and the administration and stakeholders to develop the right solution now, one that's thoughtful, carefully crafted, and successful in restoring balanced competition in the marketplace. The urgent objective is to make sure that all our farmers and ranchers can reap the benefits of tax reform, and we are committed to taking action on a solution as soon as possible. Next, now that we have a new tax code built for a new era of American prosperity, this committee and the Treasury Department have a shared responsibility to ensure this new tax law is working on behalf of all Americans. This includes holding the IRS accountable, making sure the agency administers our tax code with a renewed focus on fairness, integrity, and taxpayer service. We also have the opportunity to build on the success of tax reform to ensure that America's economy continues to grow. Our local businesses told us the slow growth status quo of 2% for the past decade simply isn't working. We decided to go bold and change that with historic reforms to help them grow and create jobs along Main Street. Just in the last few days, just in town hall meetings across our district, I've heard from local restaurant owners who are adding new workers, from an auto dealers who's adding 2 more employees, from a business that is increasing their purchase of American-made construction equipment by $2 million this year because of the tax code. And at a dinner the other night, a local in Navasota, Texas, ran into a business owner who has 160 workers. Every one of them got a 10% pay raise because of this new tax code. This is happening all over America. For the first time in years, there's a renewed sense of optimism and confidence along Main Street. Now, it's our job to help make sure this growth continues for years to come. Reading the President's budget, we're pleased to see proposals to accomplish this economic growth. We're eager to work together to find common ground, keep our economy moving forward, and not only leapfrog America to the lead of the pack around the world, but more importantly, keep us there. Today, we've accomplished a lot of important things together on behalf of our communities, and right now we have a strong economy that's growing stronger with the help of tax reform. We're looking forward to always continuing to work to fine-tune our code for America. We're excited to move forward with President Trump and especially with you as well, Secretary Mnuchin. Again, thanks for being here. We look forward to your testimony. With that, I yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Neal, for the purposes of his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Secretary Mnuchin. A budget is a reflection of America's values, and President Trump's budget is no exception. As we have seen time and again, the administration is focused on the needs of the wealthy and the powerful instead of our middle-class families. From attacking America's health care and Social Security to dismantling protections for struggling families, we have seen the trend. For example, the Trump budget cuts Medicare by over $500 billion, jeopardizing this important program for older Americans. We saw these same priorities last year when the President and Republicans rammed through a $2.3 trillion tax cut for the wealthy in corporate America and sowed confusion across the country, as noted in the Chairman's opening comments about what needs to be corrected. While Republicans claim that their bill will benefit average Americans, the evidence is clear. 83% of the benefit goes to those directly at the very top. Let's be clear. Republicans' priority with tax legislation is wealthy and big corporations and not the middle class. While big companies and the most well-off and well-connected reap massive benefits, tens of thousands of workers are being laid off, and middle-class families are not seeing the gains that Republicans have promised. I saw this myself back home in Massachusetts when the legislation first passed. Their tax plan limits the SALT deduction to $10,000. However, the bill allowed for taxpayers to prepay their 2018 property taxes before the close of 2017. In Massachusetts, there was a tremendous amount of interest in doing this, and we saw an influx of lines at city halls and town halls across the state. In fact, in an attempt to help my constituents find their way through the maze of confusion, I asked the IRS to issue guidance to help taxpayers make these payments. However, instead of issuing taxpayer-friendly guidance, the IRS issued guidance that complicated matters further and even limited middle-class families' ability to take advantage of this tax benefit. That is not putting the middle class first in my book. The Republican tax law also is fiscally irresponsible. The law adds at least $2.3 trillion to the nation's debt while giving massive tax cuts to people at the top. Republicans claim these massive tax cuts will pay for themselves. Even the budget director, Mick Mulvaney, has noted that is simply not true. However, tax cuts don't pay for themselves. We all pay for those tax cuts. The White House budget director essentially admitted that yesterday, as I noted, and to pay for these handouts, Speaker Ryan and the Trump budget are clear in their intentions to cut funding for programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, vital benefits that hardworking Americans have paid into and earned. We can do better. Instead of cutting programs that middle-class families rely on, I call on my colleagues to work on a bipartisan basis now to fix the many problems that the tax bill has created. One example, Mr. Secretary, and I want to thank you for your kindness on that matter, we addressed the issue of the multi-employer pension plan dilemma the country confronts, and you were attuned to that, and we talked about it. So I'm hoping this year that these American workers who plan for their retirement and year after year chose to contribute to their pensions instead of taking wage increases will be in the position to seek some relief. After working for those 30-plus years as iron workers, truck drivers, and auto workers, their planned retirements were taken away from them, and taken it away at a time when they no longer have the ability to prepare for retirement because they're already living in retirement. We need to help these Americans whose retirements are at risk by no fault of their own. This is a bipartisan issue. I'm hopeful that the new Joint Select Committee on Solvency of Multi-Employer Pension Plans will be successful in developing solutions. Secretary Mnuchin, I also asked the administration to help us with these efforts. Our goal is to work on this committee with these families and to put them first and act together to create opportunities for the middle class. I do want to acknowledge your staff and you for your work on what is known as the crumbling foundations issue across Connecticut and Massachusetts, and the staff reacted very swiftly, and the IRS was aligned with the position you took, and many families will receive and derive that benefit. So on that basis, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Today's sole witness is Stephen Mnuchin, Secretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury. And Ms. Secretary, the committee has received your written statement and will be made part of the formal hearing record. We've reserved 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Ms. Secretary, welcome, and you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you. I'd also like to express my condolences for the tragic shooting, and also the thanks to the many first responders and teachers that saved so many people's lives. Chairman Brady, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, it is good to be here with you today. As Treasury Secretary, I am focused on advancing the President's policies that will bring prosperity to the American people through economic growth. This is a core focus of the President, and he is delivering. Last year, the economy had 2 straight quarters of 3% or higher GDP growth, and the growth rate was higher than the average of the previous 20 years. The cornerstone of returning to more robust growth is deregulation and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This law is already providing relief to middle-income families by putting money directly back into the pockets of hard-working American families. Since the law was enacted, over 350 companies have announced bonuses, wage increases, higher 401k matches, new hiring, benefiting more than 4 million employees. We are seeing the fastest wage growth since 2009. This is a meaningful difference to the lives of millions of American families. Our reforms are making American companies competitive again, which is having an effect on the economic success of the nation. The act lowered the statutory corporate rate from 35%, one of the highest in the industrial world, to 21%, below the average. It also encourages companies to bring back profits that have been sitting overseas by eliminating the tax incentive to keeping that money offshore. Turning to the budget, the fiscal 2019 budget reflects last year's tax reform legislation, which reduces the burden on taxpayers and sets the country for long-term growth. The policies in the budget will drive down spending and grow the economy, which are both critical to putting the nation on sound fiscal path over the long term and reducing the budget deficit as a share of GDP. This past year has been an important step forward for the country. We will continue to progress by enacting policies that enable American people to succeed. And I look forward to continuing to work with Congress and this committee to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your excellent testimony. So, given that the last votes of the week are scheduled around 11:30, to make sure as many members have an opportunity to question the Secretary, we will put question time at 3 minutes, and I'll lead off with a very brief question. You know, one of the key pillars of tax reform, letting Americans keep more of their hard-earned dollars. Once tax reform is enacted, the administration acted quickly to update the withholding tables to reflect the new tax code, which means this month, over 90% of Americans will see a reduction in their taxes and bigger paychecks and take-home pay. Can you briefly talk about the Treasury's development of the recently released wage withholding guidance and your plans for putting out additional information that allow families to fine-tune further their withholding provisions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're very pleased both the work at the Office of Tax Policy within Treasury is working very closely with the IRS, and they have successfully updated the withholding table. So as you mentioned, over 90% of Americans will see tax cuts. We also expect to release next week, the IRS will put up a calculator that will allow families to go and double check their withholding based upon the new tax law and update their forms if necessary. So we're very pleased with the work that's being done at the IRS on this.
Great, and families will be able to fine-tune according to their unique situations going forward. Great. Mr. Neal, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, following World War II, labor unions negotiated with employers to create industry-wide multi-employer pension plans. In exchange for their hard work, workers were promised a long-term financial security in retirement. While that system worked well for many years, deregulation and industry insolvencies have led many plans into trouble. Today, more than 1 million Americans are in multi-employer pension plans that are now facing insolvency. It's critical that we address this crisis and help those retirees and the retirement plans that are still at risk. In November, I introduced legislation that would offer troubled multi-employer pension plans and those who are not in unions as well, low-interest rate loans to pay retirees benefits. The loans will be funded through money from the private sector through the issuance of bonds. My bill does not allow for benefit cuts. Your department has a critical role in pension regulation oversight of the nation, and a large number of experts in the field are on your staff. Providing resources and other support to develop a solution, could you speak for a moment to what is about to become another part of the crisis that America is facing in retirement security?
So thank you very much, and we agree that there are significant issues here. The Treasury does play a significant role around the multi-employers, but has limited ability to approve certain changes. And we look forward to working with the bipartisan committee, and as I mentioned yesterday at the Senate, we would be more than pleased to provide technical assistance to the committee as Congress looks at solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome. I see the budget includes a proposal to stop individuals who are not authorized to work from claiming the child tax credit. I have long had a proposal to require the Social Security number for the refundable child tax credit. It is especially relevant now, given the ongoing debate on immigration. Mr. Secretary, for the record, can an individual claim the refundable credit with just an individual taxpayer identification number, yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. Doesn't this mean the individuals who aren't allowed to work can get this, yes or no?
Actually, I just want to modify my last statement and just be clear. The IRS has allowed, that is an issue that we are looking at the legal issues associated with. So I just want to clarify it, that I'm not making a commitment going forward. We are looking at the legal issues associated with this.
Well, I'm glad you're getting into it. Thank you. By the way, I just had a joint tax score on my bill. It saves $13.3 billion. To address another issue, as you may know, the 2016 NDAA included significant retirement reforms, such as a new match for the service members' retirement contributions. However, due to an inadvertent error, some Guard and reservists who have a civilian retirement account won't be able to get the match, and I think that's wrong. Why is that? Because the IRS caps the amount an individual can save for their retirement through work each year. Mr. Secretary, the IRS allows state and local government workers to contribute the maximum to both government and civilian retirement accounts. Don't you think our brave men and women in uniform should be allowed to do the same?
Thank you very much. And my staff has raised this issue with me, and we are looking at it carefully and figuring out what we can do. Obviously, we want to do everything we can to support the military and the men and women who are supporting the country.
Thank you. I appreciate that effort. Keep it up. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
Welcome. Your statement talks a lot about tax cuts for the middle class. When you were here last year, you said there would be no absolute tax cut for the upper class. And we now have joint tax committee data, and it shows that those with income over $1 million or more would receive an average tax cut of over $64,000 next year under the tax law. Do you disagree with that?
I have no reason to disagree with the numbers. I don't have them in front of me, but I'll assume what you're citing is correct.
Well, I think that makes your glasses kind of rose-colored.
No, again, and I want to clarify this, because what I said at the beginning of last year, which was the case, it was the president's objective to offset any tax cuts with the eliminations of other deductions. We worked closely with the House and the Senate, and this was an issue we looked at very carefully.
I understand that, but you said last year there would be no absolute tax cut for the upper class, and the data just shows otherwise. Your budget assumes a 3% increase, growth rate. Today, there's an article by Jason Furman that hoping for 3% or more is folly. Already, this budget has an immense deficit. If the growth rate is 2% instead of 3%, do you know how much the deficit would increase next year?
Well, again, first of all, it's actually our projection's 2.9 and not 3, but that's
Okay.
close enough. But
I just averaged
we,
1/10.
we stand behind our projections. Many people have said over the last year that we can't get there. We've had over 3%. President Obama had actually projected 4% GDP in one of his budgets.
Okay, but
So,
let me just interrupt,
we-
because I just have three, I hate to do that, but they give us 3 minutes, and your statement was, I think, the most generalized of any statement I remember from a secretary. Do you know if you're wrong, and it's not 2.9%, but 2% that most economists think, do you know how much the deficit would be next year?
Again, what I'd be happy to say is that the static score was $1.5 trillion. So if we got no growth, that would be the difference as to what it would be, which we don't believe.
So it would be $1.5 trillion next year?
No, that was over the 10-year period.
What would it be next year?
I don't have that number in front of me, but I'd be happy to get back to you on it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reichert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Beginning with Chairman Dave Kemp years ago, and now through the leadership of Chairman Brady, we began, I've been on this committee, I think this is my 10th year, so 7 or 8 years ago, process of meetings and hearings and proposals, and we finally achieved something historic, tax reform to benefit American families and businesses. With each passing week, we see positive impacts all across the country. Businesses in my home state of Washington have announced bonuses for their employees, pay increases for their employees, investments in workforce development, and increases in employee match gift programs. I want to expand just a little bit on a question that Chairman Brady had. So you've got the withholding tables, you've got the calculator. What other regulatory efforts are you putting forth to spread the good news to the United States citizens across this country about this tax code? How are you sharing information, and how can we help you?
Well, we have a massive effort at the IRS to implement the new tax bill. It touches everything from forms that we're updating to make them user-friendly, to customer service, to technology. And we are putting out guidance every week in an effort to help taxpayers understand and provide certainty. So we're very focused on that.
Thank you. We all look forward to working with you to educate the public on the new tax code. In closing, building on last year's accomplishments, the House has passed 2 bills with overwhelming bipartisan support to boost competitiveness of U.S. companies. A renewal of GSP and MTB. There is more we need to do in partnership with the administration. I want to finish this work with a successful NAFTA update and a fully operational export-import bank. An estimated tens of billions of dollars of deals for the U.S. companies are waiting in the bank's pipeline. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Reichert. Mr. Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I agree with Mr. Neal that the budget is a reflection of our values and our priorities. I ask one simple question. Is there any money in the budget to deal with the proliferation of gun violence?
I'm not aware of that level of detail in the budget for me to be the expert to attest on
Well,
that.
in light of what happened yesterday,
I will say, personally, I think the gun violence, it's a tragedy what we've seen yesterday, and I urge Congress to look at these issues.
do you propose to do something?
I have vast responsibilities as Treasury Secretary, but this is out of my lane of responsibility.
You're part of this administration, and we're losing hundreds and thousands of people, young children, in school, trying to get an education, and they're murdered. Teachers, a football coach. And you're saying to me, who represent the people in Georgia, the city of Atlanta, where we have the CDC, someone in this government told the CDC to end a study of gun violence. We can do better. We must do better. We have to save our children, our citizens, our teachers. So do you have anything, or are you willing to?
I assure you I appreciate the severity and the tragedy, and I will speak to the President and the other cabinet members.
Well, thank you very much.
If I may, Mr. Secretary, in your seat yesterday with Secretary Azar talking about the HHS budget, we spent a lot of time on increased funding for opioid crisis in research, but we didn't spend time on the increased funding for mental health care and research into that, which often spurs, unfortunately, these tragic incidents as well. Mr.
It's not just mental health. We have to do something to control the proliferation of gun violence. Too many guns.
Well, we may
This
disagree.
will not be kind to us. We continue to go down this path, down this road.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Roskin, you're recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, the recent IRS guidance related to the prepayment of property taxes has created confusion for my constituents in Illinois. Here's why. The guidance relates to the prepayment of 2018 property taxes. My constituents in 2017 were actually prepaying their 2017 property taxes. We pay in arrears in Illinois. And I would contend that as a result, the guidance doesn't apply to them. In Illinois, there's further a longstanding custom, which I understand dates back for decades, which the IRS has never objected to, whereby the sellers of real property prepay their share of the current property taxes, even though the tax bill wouldn't arrive until the following year. This is because the seller is liable for their share under Illinois law. Thus, the longstanding custom is for the seller to estimate the amount of taxes they owe and deduct that amount on their federal tax return. And again, to my knowledge, the IRS has never objected to this. And as far as I can tell, Illinois is the only state in the country that pays in arrears. So said another way, if prepayments were disallowed, Illinois citizens would be the only ones that were not allowed to pay their 2017 property taxes without limit. And again, we're not asking about prepaying 2018 taxes. This is completely unique as to paying 2017 taxes. Would you be willing to work with me in meetings to resolve and bring clarity to this issue?
Yeah, so first of all, I can tell you I've already had 2 meetings on this issue. I am aware of it. It is unique, and we are working with the Office of Tax Policy and the IRS to try to get comfortable if they have the authority to issue guidance on effectively the 2017 taxes. So we don't have a decision yet, but I can tell you we're actively working on this.
Thank you. Let me just shift gears quickly to Iran and the commercial sales of aircraft. The last time we talked about this publicly was back in May. At that time, you said that you were studying this issue. There obviously have been no licenses that have been issued by the department, and for that I commend you and I thank you profoundly. Since that time, Iran has done nothing, I would argue, to make a case that it deserves commercial aircraft. They sent a drone into Israel in an incredibly provocative way. They've gone after their own citizens in an incredibly provocative way. They're active in Yemen, backing militants and so forth. Would you agree with me that at the very least, Iran has done nothing further to further its cause in gaining access to commercial aircraft?
So as you've pointed out, we haven't issued any licenses. That shouldn't be interpreted as a decision that we're not going to, but it also shouldn't be interpreted as a decision that we are prepared to issue licenses. And I can tell you, we are working with the Intel community, and this will be a decision that is further reviewed at the NSC and with the President before we issue any licenses.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. You're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. After repeated refusals to answer tax questions before this committee last year, finally we have an opportunity each to ask you an entire 3 minutes of questions. I think it's the congressional committee equivalent of government by tweet. But I do have 3 questions for you. The first one is that according to the joint tax analysis, the rate drop for the top tax bracket cost the Treasury $220 billion. That's for people that earn $500,000 a year in income. You promised that there would be no absolute tax cut for the upper class, and the President said much the same. The Trump budget proposes to cut student aid programs over the budget period about the same amount, $200 billion. I think that's the ticket to the middle class, and it's also the ticket to keeping our workforce competitive. Wouldn't restoring that top rate allow us, and it's a top rate that all of the Republican members of this committee thought was perfectly adequate when it was voted out of this committee. As you know, this was something that got added on in conference. Wouldn't that restoration allow us to avoid those student assistance cuts, or if you don't want to do that, at least to moderate the harsh reduction in Medicaid that the President said would never occur? The second question, and I'll just ask you to respond to all three at once, concerns the claim that every American household would get $4,000 every year in increased household income. In fact, when you came out of hiding on December 17th on Fox News, you said it would be $4,500 for every family. Isn't it true, or do you disagree with the recent survey that 98% of Americans have not received any additional compensation at all? And while I'm very pleased that somebody gets even $1.50 a week in additional benefit from this bill, isn't it true that there are very few Americans, if any, who've actually gotten $4,500 in additional wage increase out of this, even though you gave a permanent tax increase and even though it's been in place now for 2 months? I assume as well that while the President wants to take credit for the few that have happened, that he doesn't want to take credit for the decision by Pfizer, one of the biggest beneficiaries, to cut Parkinson's and Alzheimer's research and terminate workers. Finally, you said yesterday that the reason that these stock buybacks may be occurring is because the companies don't have a good reason to invest in America. Isn't that an indication that some of this tax bill was misplaced, since so much of the money is going to corporate buybacks?
Gentleman's time has expired. If you'd answer
Can we
Mr.
hear from
Doggett
him on any
in
of
a
those?
written, excuse me, Mr. Doggett. Your time has expired. If you'd like to, if you would respond in writing to Mr. Doggett, we'll move forward with the hearing. Mr. Buchanan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today, and I want to thank you for your leadership. Let me talk about growth in terms of the next 10 years, but quickly taking a look at the last 10 years, we've had little or no growth, the slowest growth in 50 years. We've run up a $10 trillion debt in those 10 years, roughly. Plenty of blame to go around. But I had a chance to speak in front of the Tax Foundation last week. They came up to me after. They're expecting $5 trillion in growth because of the new tax law. And I wanted to get your thoughts about the impact in terms of not the growth is going to have on debt and deficits, because we are all concerned about the $20 trillion in debt, especially the last 10 years we've accumulated another $10 trillion. So as we look forward, can you expand a little bit in terms of your thoughts in terms of the growth and the impact on debt and deficits? Because what we've been doing the last 10 years, clearly not working. I'd like to get your thoughts.
Sure, thank you. So, I stand behind the numbers that I've cited before. The difference between the 2.2 and the 2.9% GDP is about $2.5 trillion. The static cost of the tax cuts was $1.5 trillion, but about half a trillion of that was the difference between policy and baseline. So we think effectively the right way to compare it is the trillion to the $2.5 trillion if we get the growth.
Also, just the impact, I've chaired the local chamber in Florida, the state chamber. Most businesses are 50 employees and less. You know that, probably 90% of the businesses in the country. The 25% tax cut for them, it seems like the enthusiasm's at a record high in terms of NFIB. Maybe you could comment on that.
We do have the highest level of confidence, and I think, as you know, for small businesses, we have the lowest tax rate for since the 1930s, and this is very important because small businesses are a big part of driving the growth in the economy.
With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Larson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your opening statement, and your sincerity, and Secretary Mnuchin, yours as well. But frankly, we're long overdue in the Congress to stop. As important as it is to express our condolences, what's more important is that we vote and we act. Secretary Mnuchin, you're right, this is not in your province, but it is exclusively in the province of the United States Congress. Hailing from Connecticut and experiencing Sandy Hook and the disasters that just keep on coming, when they come for one of us and we do nothing, who's next? When will we stand up? And all is required is that we do our constitutional responsibility and vote. Otherwise, we are all complicit in what happens increasingly and with devastating impact on our children. What are we as a body or an institution if we're not going to stand up for our children? And if you disagree with universal background checks, fine. At least vote. At least let people know where you stand on this issue. Families, victims, the country deserves it. You're good people. We're a great nation. The nation deserves this Congress to act. Secretary, I do know that you can carry that message back to the president, and I do believe that this president can make a dramatic difference by calling upon this Congress to act on a multitude of areas, not the least of which is this tragic issue we face. I want to thank you as well, Mr. Neal mentioned it, for the work the Treasury has done on crumbling foundations, not unlike China drywall. I want to thank Representative Courtney for his leadership and Representative Neal in this area as well. But the Treasury Department went overboard when what was rather a cruel thing when members found out first that they could get a deduction and then the tax reform, so-called, took it away. With that, I can't commend you enough. But also, as Mr. Neal pointed out, the inequality here for Connecticut residents, the double taxation that exists, when we find out that more than 750,000 people who make itemized deductions end up really supplementing everybody else's tax cut. That simply is unfair. 3 minutes does not allow enough time for me to go into that, but I thank you and I hope to work with you to correct that and amend that travesty.
Mr. Paulson, you're recognized.
Thank you, and welcome, Mr. Secretary, here today. I want to echo the thoughts of many of my colleagues and tell you how encouraged I am to be seeing the benefits already of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Although it's been less than 2 months since the reform legislation became law, we are already seeing its positive effects. Shortly after they were able to analyze the effects of these lower rates, we had Minnesota companies like TCF Bank, U.S. Bank, Best Buy, Wells Fargo, all be able to give out special bonuses to their employees, increase their employee wages, to invest more in their savings plans. The bottom line is this is real money that's going into the pockets of hardworking Minnesotans and Americans, and they're investing in their employees for the future. And because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the medium income family of 4 in the 3rd District of Minnesota is going to have an average tax cut of about $2,232. And a lot of folks, if you've been mentioned already because of the withholding tables, aren't going to have to wait till next year to see those dollars in their pocket. The new withholding rules are now put out by the IRS just in January. Everyone now is checking the check. They know that they're going to have those dollars in their pocket. 90% of all Americans seeing that in their paychecks right now in February. So I want to thank you for your involvement in helping us move that through. I also want to mention, though, it's really not surprising to see the other economic indicators that are really trending in a very positive direction. For example, the Bureau of Economic Analysis now reports that private sector investment was up actually 8.8% in the last quarter of 2017 compared to the growth of less than 1% in the first quarter of 2017. And Mr. Secretary, there is no doubt in my mind that businesses large and small were making these investments in large part of anticipation for tax reform passing and getting it across the finish line. And those investments now are resulting in a growing competitive economy. And when a business makes equipment investment, it typically means they're also going to be hiring more people and they're going to be increasing productivity. And this is a good indicator of wage growth yet to come. So these are all positive economic impacts that are helping hardworking taxpayers across the country, and they're helping middle-income families. Mr. Secretary, I also want to just say I look forward to continuing to open the newspaper to hear the positive stories on television, the real-life stories about the positive impacts of the tax reform legislation that is now law. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're touching on a variety of areas. One that you do have a great deal of influence on deals with the supervision of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network I mentioned to you a moment ago. I appreciated your testimony in the Senate that you recognize some of the challenges where we have an emerging legal cannabis industry throughout the United States. It's about $8 billion now, moving past $20 billion, over 200,000 employees, and there's this air of uncertainty about access to banking services. The Obama administration issued some guidance to allow banks to open accounts for people who grow, process, and retail sales of marijuana. But still, there are many of them that don't have access to banking services. It is a threat to public safety. It's an invasion for money laundering, tax evasion, money laundering, theft. I hope that there would be a way for us to work together to seek further clarification and improvement. I would welcome an expression today if you're supporting it and trying to move it forward. I understand that you're reviewing it, but I would hope at a minimum that we could work with our committee to try and develop with you appropriate rules for tax and banking for the cannabis industry, that we could work with the financial services industry to develop access to traditional lending for this emerging part of our economy. Do you have any sense of what the timeline is going to be for the review that you're undertaking and how expansive it might be?
So first of all, let me say we're always happy to meet with the committee and discuss these issues. This is a complicated issue. We are actively looking at this at FinCEN, particularly in light of the DOJ decision. So this is something I can't tell you exactly when we're going to come out with guidance, but I can tell you it's on the top of the list and we're working on it as we speak.
Mr. Chairman, this is one item that affects a variety of people on this committee, from Washington to Maine. As I mentioned, it's a growing part of the economy. 97% of the American public have access to some form of state legal marijuana product. And I would hope that the committee might be able to delve into this a little bit to seek clarification and prevent the insanity of having this state legal activity be forced to be conducted on an all-cash basis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Martin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We're experiencing an incredible building boom now. Our economy is what I hope the economy of the entire United States begins to look like over the next few years. I truly believe the tax cuts bill will become that engine that drives that economy. My cities are in state is excited about the new infrastructure plan. They are beginning to scratch their heads a little bit about how they will finance that plan and what projects what projects they'll put forward that will fit the formula. Is there any thought to going back and creating an instrument such as the Build America bond that we had that was so popular years ago? Is there any interest or any plans to go back and look at that kind of a funding system that cities can tap, and so that they can put their part of the capital into those projects, or a similar instrument to that?
Well, it's not currently being contemplated, but let me just say we obviously look forward to working with Congress on infrastructure, which is an important part of the President's agenda and how we finance it, as you said.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Mr. Kine, you're recognized. Oh, excuse me. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleagues, too, for yielding. I can't see you, Mr. Secretary, but I just wanted to, on Tuesday, September 25th of last year, there was a meeting in the White House. It was regarding the blueprint for the tax cut plan. You were present, the president was there, the vice president was there, the chief of staff was there, Gary Cohen was there. Do you remember that meeting?
I don't remember the exact specifics of it, but yes.
Okay, I'd asked the president specifically about infrastructure, and he kind of went off. He was very interested in the issue. He was very exercised, and he categorically rejected the workability, the viability of public-private partnerships. In fact, at that meeting, he pointed to the vice president and told the group that public-private partnerships don't work as it relates to infrastructure, and cited Indiana as an example. Do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah. In August of 2017, the Wall Street Journal did a story headlined, Indiana Highway Gives Black Eyes to Public-Private Partnership in Funding Infrastructure. And the president was referring specifically to a 21-mile stretch of highway. In Indiana, they refer to it as the Highway to Hell. It was a project, it was a private-state partnership signed by the vice president in 2014 when he was governor. And the project was 2 years behind schedule and only 60% built before the state took over the project and financed it in a more traditional way. The infrastructure plan is not the entire federal budget, sir, but it certainly is a centerpiece of it. And when you have 56,000 structurally deficient bridges in America, when every second of every day 7 cars drive on a bridge that's structurally deficient, that is an urgent call for a real infrastructure bill. The bill that you've put together, or the White House has put together, for every $6.50 of state and local spending, the federal government will spend $1. That's it. And so that means more state and local taxes on top of the gasoline tax that they already pay, and on top of the tolls that will come along with this. I'd just like you to respond to it. If it wasn't workable in September of 2017, why is it workable now?
Well, I think as you've outlined and you've heard, the president does have concerns in certain cases of things being privatized and private-public partnerships. That's not an across the board, but as you've outlined from the meeting, there are certain areas he doesn't think we should be selling off.
Okay, you're back, and thank you. And thank you again to my colleagues.
Thank you. Chairman would like to recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Secretary. It's good to have you here today. I want to go to the area that we looked a lot at in our budget, and that was fraud and abuse. And there are an awful lot of dollars that are out there. And I want to first commend the President and OMB for taking a look at that. 2 areas that have been talked about a lot in this committee. One is child tax credits, which was Representative Johnson's. And then mine is the tuition-related tax expenses that required Social Security numbers for students. And we all agree that we want to help those who really need the help. There is a lot of fraud and abuse out there. So first of all, I want to say thank you for looking at this, because OMB actually put out a statement that said that from the increased efforts from all forms of these tax credits and the oversight enforcement could raise $43.8 billion over the next decade, which is a lot of money that we can use to help people that really deserve it and need it, rather than those that are trying to go over beyond the system. So can you tell me, beside these 2 that I have already mentioned, any others that you might be looking at where we would use Social Security numbers, which are the identifying number that we all use for everything, that we might be looking at to save these dollars in these programs and prevent the fraud and abuse?
Well, I can tell you, actually, it's an issue that I've started to spend a lot of time on, because we administer a lot of tax credits through the IRS based upon Social Security numbers. And I am in the process of having meetings with the Social Security Department in understanding how we're going to move forward with technology, smart Social Security cards, how we can protect that information. I think, as you know, on most credit cards today, you have a unique identifier in other ways, and we need to figure out how we use technology to protect us against fraud, which we think at the IRS is quite significant.
Well, thank you, because we know that we've heard it over and over again right here in the Ways and Means Committee when we do the oversight hearings. We've heard it over and over again how people are going around the system and are getting something that they don't deserve. And so I applaud the administration. I look forward to hearing more about it. And thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Kine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you for being here and engaging us today. In a moment, I'm going to ask you whether you, as part of the President's economic team and budget team, has any plans moving forward to get our fiscal house in order. But before I do that, let me remind you that you currently work for a boss who is quoted as saying, "I'm the king of debt. I'm great with debt. Nobody knows debt better than me. I've made a fortune by using debt, and if things don't work out, I'll just renegotiate the debt." I mean, that's the smart thing to do. He was also quoted as saying, "I would borrow, knowing that if the economy crashed, you just make a deal. And if the economy was good, it's good. So therefore, you can't lose." One of the problems I had with the tax bill is that it was one of the principles in working on a bipartisan tax reform bill is that it would be revenue neutral. We'd shut down egregious loopholes, tax breaks that special interests were able to jam into the code throughout the years, the so-called expenditures. That clearly wasn't the case. We ended up with a tax cut bill where 83% of the benefit goes to the wealthiest 1%, and $1.5 trillion was not offset. It was not paid for. You include interest on the debt on that over the next 10 years, you're pushing $2 trillion of additional debt in our fiscal house. And it's little wonder that right after last week's budget bill where we blew through the caps, another $500 billion on top of that, the administration submits a budget this week that calls for cuts to Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid of $2 trillion. Coincidence? I don't think so. And I would humbly submit that you're not going to be able to push through Congress cuts of $2 trillion to Medicare and Medicaid over the next 10 years. The American people won't stand for it. And I mentioned during the debate that unlike the tax cuts of 81 or 2001 or 2003, it's different this time because we're not in a position to make a huge fiscal mistake, not with 70 million baby boomers beginning their massive retirement, 10,000 a day, joining Medicare and Social Security. And yet that's exactly what this Congress and this administration did in your complicity, is made that huge fiscal mistake and setting future generations up for failure. Because the Bank of China is open now, and we're going to have to borrow a lot of money in order to finance these cuts and the spending increases that were just passed last week in the budget. And that is not going to be good for long-term economic growth. And there's going to be a day of reckoning. You give me or any member on this diet an opportunity to write $1.5 trillion worth of hot checks, and I'll give you the illusion of wealth. I'll give you the illusion of growth. But there will be a day of reckoning, and this is going to come home, and it's going to hit us sooner rather than later. And that's the challenge. So again, I ask you whether this administration is putting together a team to get serious about getting our long-term fiscal house in order, or are we just going to renegotiate if things collapse on us?
Time has expired. Mr. Reed, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And before I get into my comments, I wanted to start on a positive note. I was proud to be part of the effort, and I thank you and your team for the efforts done on tax reform, because I think tax reform is going to lead to huge amounts of opportunity across the country, and that is a cornerstone to getting our fiscal house in order to have growth, to have private sector job creation, to create new wealth, and I think that is a major part of the solution. But I do have to agree with my colleague from Wisconsin on the other side of the aisle. I am afraid. I ran for Congress in 2010 on the issue of the debt crisis, on the issue of the national debt becoming too large to be sustainable for the future of America. And after last week, and after much soul-searching, I've come to the conclusion, and I'll be the first one to say it publicly here on this committee for the first time, that I believe the debt crisis is now upon us, that this is the day of reckoning. It is not tomorrow, but we are starting to see that debt crisis explode as we speak. And I would ask you and the administration to make sure that if we're going through this debt crisis, that we have policies proactively to try to mitigate the impact of that crisis as we speak. Because as has been indicated, if interest rates go up, and we know they're going to go up, the magnitude of the debt service, I don't think the American people can appreciate. You know, I've done some rough calculations, and just going up to 3.6% of debt service obligations on an interest rate is about an extra $520 billion a year just to pay interest. And people can relate to that when you talk to them about their credit cards, when you talk to them about their mortgage payments back home. And if you told them that you had to come up with $520 billion of additional interest payments, they would then ask the question, well, where are you going to get that money? And then you put that in perspective of where we spend money across the budget. We spend $840 billion on Social Security. Defense, we're going to spend about $700 billion. If interest rates go up to 6.83%, this is what I asked a panel of economists about 2 years ago when I started to try to be the canary in the coal mine to say this is happening, this will happen if we don't get our fiscal house in order. 6.83%, you're at about $1 trillion for additional interest payments. I don't know how we sustain that. And you're a very smart man, Mr. Treasury Secretary. How do you sustain that type of debt load and keep America strong and vibrant going forward?
Well, I think, first of all, the President shares your concern that the debt has gone from $10 trillion to $20 trillion over the last 8 years, and these are issues we need to look at, and we look forward to working with you.
I appreciate that. I look forward to working with you. It's imperative we get this in order.
Thank you. Mr. Pascrell, you're recognized.
Mr. Secretary, welcome. The tax bill that was pushed through cost more than $1.5 trillion, and then we add the interest and it goes on forever. Money that we borrowed from the future. 80% of the money we spent went to the top 1%. Some would say a little more than that. Wells Fargo alone got a handout of $3.4 billion from the U.S. Treasury. You are the Secretary of the Treasury. After they cheated millions of customers, opened fake accounts, overcharged veterans, they got this reward. But following this tax cut, they were paying their shareholders $22.5 billion, their shareholders. That's 102 times the amount they're putting into charity and wage increases combined. At the same time, Mr. Secretary, they're closing 900 branches. So, here's my first question, Mr. Secretary, because I heard you insult a lot of big states many times. Let's get it straight here, right from the horse's mouth. You stated repeatedly last year that we needed to eliminate the state and local tax deduction because we had to get out of the business of subsidizing states. Who wrote that talking point for you? Because you seem to repeat it over and over again like a broken record. And I told you last year, and I'll say it again, New Jersey subsidizes low states. That's baloney. With my state getting back at 74 cents on the dollar, it contributes to federal revenue. Now with the Trump tax cuts, we'll be contributing even more. How dare you insult those states? And you also said in your statement that what they need to do is cut their taxes. Well, we all try to cut taxes. But you know that bill went back to the Civil War, long before the tax code even came into existence, to make sure that the local communities, the county communities, the state communities had enough money and resources to get by year after year. That is an insult. This week, the director of the National Intelligence, the CIA, the FBI, and other leading intelligence officials warned that Russia might be meddling. They did meddle in the 2016 election and will use a digital strategy to worsen it this year. I understand the administration is working on implementing sanctions required by the Bipartisan Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions Act. The bill that garnered more than 400 votes. How many sanctions did the President direct you to impose?
Thank you. All time has expired. If you would answer
Can I get an answer?
Question in writing. Members know that if you want
yes
the
or no?
Secretary to answer, give him time, leave him time to do so.
Mr. Chairman.
So, Mr. Kelly,
Come on.
you recognize the question, Secretary.
We're all human beings.
Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Commissioner, thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to correct something real quick. First of all, the claim that the benefits gives 83% of the benefits to the top 1%. First of all, that's based on a tax policy center data for 2027, which, doing the math, that's about 10 years from now. The reality, in 2019 alone, over $100 billion in tax cuts will go to families making under $200,000. This is out of $180 billion in total tax cuts. Therefore, 56% of the tax cuts go to families making under $200,000. So could we please quit separating our people with this tax code and saying somehow only the wealthy? But I want to thank you, first of all, for tax cuts. I spent some time at the auto show in Washington, and every maker I went up to, whether it was Chevrolet, Ford, Chrysler, whomever, the first thing they say, thank you so much for the tax cuts bill. This is something that's working in such a positive manner. Now, not here in this chamber, but when I'm back home in Pennsylvania, I have the same reaction from people who are glad to get the crumbs. And in the business that I'm in, sometimes $4 a month makes the difference between somebody being able to buy a car or truck or not buying a car or truck, so it's all important. The big issue that I want to get with you, and I know you're already on this, and Earl Blumenauer and I are working on this together, on P3 legislation. We do have something called the Public Buildings Renewal Act, which would permit tax-exempt financing of certain government-owned buildings by expanding the definition of exempt facility bonds. And I know we're going to talk about that with infrastructure. The other issue is on conservation easements. As you know, the conservation easement provisions were made permanent as a part of the PATH Act. This legislation that Mike Thompson and I have, and it was authored in a previous Congress, has had broad bipartisan and bicameral support. Unfortunately, there's some language out there now that turns the corner on that and doesn't present it in the right way. So I'm going to really appreciate working with you on this. The other thing, and I want to make this just so you know, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the administration for stepping out of the private sector and coming into Washington, D.C. And the poster, I think, that I remember more than anything I ever saw is the beatings will continue until morale improves. When we see the massive economic revival that's taking place in this country, and the only card we can play is we still hate Trump. When millions and millions of people are receiving the benefits of legislation that's taken place and what the president's been able to do, mostly on his own, by the way, in the first year, to improve the lives of everyday hardworking American taxpayers and citizens, that's something to be lauded. And so it's hard to come in here and hear everything else out there and who struck John. And listen, the brave talk about entitlement reform is only going to take place before election time. It will never take place when we actually have to make those cuts, when 70% of our budget is automatic and has absolutely no ceiling. That is a huge problem. I don't care if you're running a car dealership, a candy shop, or running a big company. This is the problem we've had. And I love this Rip Van Winkle effect that apparently for almost 15 years or 10 years, the other side has sat in some type of a slumber, didn't realize we went from $9 trillion in debt to $20 trillion in debt, and all of a sudden, debt is now a concern. Thank you for your service. I appreciate everything you do. Let's just keep moving forward.
Yes, Mr. Crowley, you had been talking out of order to the Secretary at the beginning, so we'll continue regular order.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Crowley,
speaking
you're
out of order?
recognized.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
when was I speaking out of order?
Questioning the Speaker without your microphone on.
I had my
So, now you recognize the question.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
I failed to recognize when I asked the gentleman any question.
No, you were speaking to the Secretary at the early part of the debate. We let it go because
I don't think I was
know
here,
you
Mr.
doing
Chairman.
this. Oh, yes, sir.
You're
recognized.
I respectfully disagree with you, Mr. Chairman.
And I respectfully disagree with you.
We're even
recognized.
there. Mr. Secretary, welcome. I think there's a new definition of reading, writing, and arithmetic. We add the fourth, and that's run for your life. And I respect your position. You hold one of the highest positions in our government. And I take you at your word. You will talk to the president about what he can do to help protect our children from the onslaught that's happening on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. 18 events in this year alone, and we're only into February. And I think that's incredibly disturbing, if not to you, to the president, to my Republican colleagues as well. Mr. Secretary, the president said on May 7, 2015, when he was running for president, he made a promise. He said, I quote, "I was the first and only potential GOP candidate to state there will be no cuts to Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid." And yet in this budget proposal, the president has proposed a $65 billion cut to Social Security, a $500 billion, a $500 billion cut to Medicare, and over $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years in cuts to the Medicaid system. That's a political promise the president apparently is never going to keep, because his budget does not reflect that at all. Mr. Secretary, on January 12th, you were quoted in the Daily Tax in reference to the issue of high state taxes, looking for creative ways to get around the tax law that caps $10,000 amount of state and local taxes. You said, and I quote, "I can assure you we will audit the real estate tax issue," end quote. That was at the January 12th at the Economic Club here in Washington. You remember making that statement?
I don't, but
It's quoted here. I would like to enter that into the
I have no reason
record.
to think I didn't. I just didn't say I specifically
Does
remember
that sound like something you would have said?
I have to read the whole thing in context.
I would like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, that statement.
No objection.
I would think my Republican colleagues would be concerned. Mr. Roscoe mentioned what's happening in his home state of Illinois. I appreciate the crocodile tears from my colleague from New York, Mr. Reed, on the epiphany that he had, the soul searching that took place after December 22nd, when he voted to increase the national debt by $2.4 trillion in the tax scam bill that was passed, as well as my other colleagues, and then additionally, just last week, by another $300 billion. That comes to a total of $2.7 trillion that just last week my Republican colleagues voted for. This epiphany now that they're worried about what the national debt. Why weren't they worried about that before? They gave the biggest tax cuts in the history of the world to the wealthiest in this nation. 83% going to the wealthiest 1%, and the most wealthiest multinational corporations in the history of the world. And now they're worried about this. I understand now why the president is cutting Social Security, Medicare, and the Medicaid system, because he's going back on that promise.
Gentleman's time
has
has expired. Mr. Renacci, as I recognize you, I'd remind everyone in attendance that our Democrat colleagues raised the national debt by $2 trillion in 1 year. 1 year. And slashed Medicare by $700 billion. Mr. Renacci, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Mnuchin, for being here today and your continued service to our country. The results of tax reform are becoming more apparent every day, and I appreciate you coming out to Ohio last week. You started to see, even in Ohio, how it's growing our economy. But still, there's work to be done in Congress and the technical clarifications at the Treasury with implementation and at the IRS with administration. Every day tax reform passed, every day since tax reform passed, another company announces it's passing its benefits along to its workers in the form of bonuses and higher wages. You saw that in Ohio. This is in addition to the direct benefit these workers are receiving due to reduced taxes. As my colleague Mr. Kelly said, the JCT noted that families making between $40,000 and $50,000 are seeing a 10% reduction in their taxes that they owe. In 2009 alone, over $100 billion of tax cuts will go to families like these, and we're seeing that. So the narrative, again, that my colleagues on the other side continue to say that this is a giveaway to corporations and wealthy Americans is just ridiculous. And as I travel the state of Ohio, I continue to hear people thanking us for those tax cuts. I would also talk about the debt crisis. I disagree with my colleague from New York. The debt crisis started about 10 years ago. It continues to go, and yes, we do have to worry about the debt crisis. One thing we have to do is we have to get growth, and I think we're getting that out of the tax and jobs bill cut, but we also got to get spending down, and we're going to have to look at mandatory spending. I sit on the Budget Committee, so I continue to look at that as well. So the one thing I do hear is my colleagues on the other side are concerned about our debts and deficits. I am glad to hear that. I hope we can work together to come up with solutions so that our children and grandchildren don't have to deal with this debt crisis. But again, the tax cut will grow our economy and allow us to grow a revenue base that will help. We cannot continue down a stagnant path that we've had the last 8 years. Mr. Secretary, I do want to bring, though, to you an issue. A number of Ohio restaurants and retailers have reached out to my office this month asking for help in addressing a drafting error. More specifically, when writing the tax reform legislation, we intended to consolidate 3 types of improvements or renovation properties into qualified improvement category. We also intended to assign the property a 15-year recovery period, which it had under the old law. However, giving a drafting error, it now appears a qualified improvement property will instead default into 39-year recovery period. I know that our committee is looking at it, but I wanted to make sure that you are aware of it, which I assume you are. And what would you say to retailers and restaurants that are nervous that that neither Congress nor the Treasurer will be able to quickly resolve this issue?
Well, first of all, I am aware of the error. It obviously was unintended. We're looking at whether there's anything we can do with regulations. I think it is likely that this is something that may need to be fixed in the bill, but we look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I'm appalled at this budget. After a $1.5 trillion tax cut for the wealthiest corporations and donors, the Trump budget proposes cutting basic necessities of everyday Americans: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food assistance, housing, and heating, just to name a few. At a time when this administration enacted complicated tax cuts, the Trump budget fails to provide substantial increases to the primary services that help real Americans with their taxes: the volunteer income tax assistant clinics, the low-income tax clinics, the tax counseling for the elderly, and the taxpayer advocate. At a time when tens of millions of middle-class taxpayers in SALT states will be grappling with tax increases and a secretary who threatened them with audits, you propose a budget with paltry increases for substantive on-the-ground assistance to help taxpayers. Further, I'm disturbed that the Trump budget lauds its investment in enforcement when your private debt collection enforcements this year targeted SSDI and SSI recipients, subjected impoverished Social Security recipients to levies even though they were impoverished, and put 45% of the studied taxpayers into installment agreements they couldn't afford. It seems that your enforcement focuses on increasing the profits of debt collectors at the expense of the disabled, retirees, and impoverished, counter to IRS policy and decency. I cannot understand why you've refused to allow the taxpayer advocate to monitor these collection calls to understand these inappropriate actions. I know that there are thousands of hardworking IRS employees who've dedicated themselves to helping taxpayers, yet your failure to prioritize everyday taxpayers, your current enforcement practices targeting vulnerable taxpayers with for-profit debt collectors, and your own threat to aggressively audit taxpayers in states like Illinois with high SALT expenses make me wary of this cruel budget. I'd like to ask you, what are you doing to remedy the harm to vulnerable taxpayers by your private debt collection program?
I look forward to, I will follow up with the IRS on the issue of the private debt collectors and see why they don't want the taxpayer advocate to monitor. I'm not familiar with that issue, but we'll follow up with it.
Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr. Chairman.
Meehan,
And thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us here today. So much of the real benefit of the hard work that you did passing tax reform really goes down to the small businesses and others, the real engine of job growth and really economic growth in our country. When they do well, the country does well. And I'm seeing a sense of enthusiasm when I'm out there talking to the grassroots. One group that has some challenges, and a lot of them admittedly are contractors, but I've got a lot of small businesses, family-owned, that have been for a period of time working with pension plan issues because they're part of multi-employer plans. You sit on the PBGC as a Secretary of Treasury. I got two questions. Can you tell me what the PBGC may be recommending to you about ways in which we might be able to resolve the concerns that the multi-employers, particularly the small employers, have in that? And then in a related way, I think that there are many small businesses that are pass-throughs that are excited about the opportunities for investment particularly taking the capital that they now have to grow their businesses. And can you give me a little bit of insight on what the kind of priorities you are going to have in terms of making recommendations or clarifying with further guidance what the pass-through deduction opportunities may be for small businesses?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, on the multi-employer, this is a complicated issue. It is a significant risk to the BGC, as you've mentioned, and we look forward to working with you and others in Congress in trying to figure out a solution for it. And as regards to pass-throughs, we are working with the IRS and the Office of Tax Policy to put together guidance so that small businesses can take advantage of the investment opportunities on the one hand, and on the other hand, make sure there are guardrails that they don't get abused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mina. Ms. Sanchez, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the Secretary for joining us today. But I have to say, in course with some of my other colleagues, that I am shocked, although maybe I shouldn't be, that less than 2 months after the Republicans passed the largest tax giveaway to multinational corporations in our nation's history, we're here discussing a budget proposal that takes even more money away from the hardworking people that I represent. At every turn, this administration never misses an opportunity to shift more of the burden onto the poor and middle-class families and the communities in which they live. Cities in my district are already staring down impossible budget choices thanks to the Republican tax scam. The law gutted state and local income tax deduction for my constituents and threw city budgets into almost certain chaos. But the Republican budget proposal before us today takes that difficulty a step further for municipalities, and when city budgets are tighter, tangible services in our communities suffer. That means that teachers don't get the supplies they need, fire stations don't get the new equipment they need, and police departments can't hire new deputies. These would be the very real effects if this preposterous budget proposal were to become law. Many cities I represent are also in desperate need of infrastructure updates, from crumbling bridges to unsafe rail crossings and long overdue highway projects. These are massive projects that need federal support and federal dollars. But instead, this budget pushes localities out on an island, forcing them to do even more with even less. How can already squeezed cities foot even more of the bill for transportation projects as the President proposes in his budget? But perhaps the single most offensive proposal in this budget is the Republican food rationing box for SNAP recipients. I am out of words to describe just how amazed I am at the depths to which this budget stoops to hurt people, but I couldn't let my time go without saying that. How in good conscience can a president sign a law containing roughly $1.5 billion in tax cuts that heavily favors billionaires and corporations that stash money overseas and then turn around and literally take fresh food out of the mouths of children? Is this our shining example of democracy to the world? I have said this every year at this hearing. Budgets are about priorities. And if this budget doesn't show exactly what this administration's true priorities are, I don't know what does. This kicks people in the teeth that are struggling to support their families and to contribute to this country. It is despicable. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for appearing here today. I know time is limited, but I wanted to touch on a couple of tax issues. One, it's my hope that we can resolve the 199A issue. There are concerns among ag producers that there's a problem there, and I hope that we can address that. Also, I would like to draw your attention to the issue of cash accounting for agriculture syndicates. And despite long-standing law and practice allowing cash accounting for family-owned agriculture production under the active participation exemption, the IRS attempted to argue in the Fifth Circuit that Burnett Ranches, family-owned for more than 100 years, was ineligible for this exemption because a family-owned S corporation was a limited partner in the ranch. The Fifth Circuit correctly ruled in favor of the Burnetts, and this decision stands across Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. However, the IRS has indicated it may continue to hold its position in other circuits, creating uncertainty for producers in the other 47 states. So it seems to me this position is contrary to the administration's efforts to provide certainty and regulatory relief for American businesses, and I strongly encourage the IRS to stand down from this position. So thank you again for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized.
Mr. Secretary, I wanted to ask my question about the Treasury Department's proposed elimination of the Community Development Financial Institution Fund. In a report your department issued June of 2017, it was said, quote, CDFIs and MDIs, minority depository institutions, are often the only source of credit and financial services in impoverished urban and rural low and moderate income areas with limited access to the banking system. Mr. Secretary, I submit to you that nothing has changed since June of 2017. This year's budget again calls to effectively eliminate the arm of the Treasury Department that aids economically distressed communities, many of which are in my district. The CDFI fund runs a number of different programs that encourage investment in poor communities around the country. They help businesses in low-income communities garner financing, and they are an integral part of the administration of the New Market Tax Credit Program, which provides tax credits to investors who provide capital organizations in low-income communities. The New Market Tax Credit has enjoyed broad bipartisan support from many members of Congress. It has earned this support due to the proven record of such a program. The CDFI fund leverages federal funds roughly 12-to-1, leading to the investment of about $3 billion in low-income distressed communities. I was wondering if you could explain to my constituents who depend upon this why your department would issue such a report that talks about its benefits and yet effectively eliminate such a fund. I'm especially curious as to why you would eliminate such a fund when it has been said time and time again, this administration has added $1.5 trillion to the budget due to a tax cut. I think it's really hypocritical, frankly, that you would add to our debt and at the same time take away tools that actually help low-income and distressed communities, especially since we live in a time when we're asking these communities to do more with less. So I don't know if you could answer that question, sir, but I'd like for you to try.
Sure, I'm happy to answer it. So first of all, let me acknowledge I do think that the CDFI funds have done tremendous work for many communities. So the Treasury is proud to have been part of administering these funds.
Why would you eliminate it?
The $1.5 trillion we feel is paid for through growth. So they're really two independent things. The CDFIs, this is just a difficult decision in looking for savings and putting more money to
why would you take,
other areas.
I just want to reclaim my time because I only have a few seconds, but why would you choose to make that kind of calculated choice, which frankly, if you do not have the kind of growth that you're saying, and I can tell you that in distressed communities that I represent, we have been waiting for the trickle down of economics to actually affect them.
Thank you.
So
Time
with all
has
due respect,
expired.
you're taking away an
Mr.
important
Holding,
tool.
you're recognized. Mr. Holding.
Mr. Secretary, it was a pleasure to work with you on tax reform. And in the 2 months since the bill was passed, middle-class families in my state of North Carolina have already begun to see the benefits of a historic law. Much like the growing trend we've seen throughout the country, businesses in North Carolina are giving out bonuses, increasing wages, and providing enhanced benefits and greater retirement plans as a result of the tax reform that we passed together. The Hammock Source in Greenville, Alley Financial in Charlotte, Atlantic Packaging in Wilmington, Lowe's in Charlotte, IAT Insurance in Raleigh, Benchmark Auto Sales in Asheville, it's just naming a few of them, have given out bonuses of 1,000 or more. Further, BB&T in Winston-Salem, Aquesta Financial Holdings in Cornelius, MetLife, which just broke ground on a second location in my district, all raised employee wages and implemented a minimum wage of at least $15 an hour. In addition to these bonuses and pay increases, the average family in my district in North Carolina will see their taxes cut by approximately $2,250. And while my friends on the other side of the aisle have characterized these benefits to hardworking families as crumbs, North Carolinians know otherwise and have directly seen the positive impact in their paycheck. I also want to briefly touch on the importance of the change to a territorial system that we accomplished on tax reform. We finally leveled the playing field for companies around the globe, and I look forward to continuing to work on that to ensure its implementation to increase competitiveness. But also, I look forward to working with you and this committee to ensure that we work towards a territorial system for our American citizens abroad, and finally end our draconian citizenship-based taxation regime. This move, much like territoriality for corporations, will increase the competitiveness of Americans in the global job market and level the playing field for individuals that is currently tilted toward their foreign counterparts. Then we will finally have a system that allows talent, not tax burden, to determine the business and hiring decisions of global corporations. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. Ms. Delbeni, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us. The administration's entire infrastructure plan is about leveraging a small federal investment through profit-driven investors. And if there's no profit to be made, it sounds like the same folks who've been left behind before are going to be left behind again. So can you tell me, do those investors plan to fund projects in struggling rural communities like Concrete or Darrington in my district or similar communities across the country, when these communities won't necessarily provide a lucrative return, but they desperately need infrastructure investments to support farmers and families and small businesses?
Well, I agree with you completely that there are many projects that won't have returns for investors, and they need to be funded either through federal dollars or state dollars. Public-private partnerships are not appropriate for everything.
Well, we have very few federal dollars in the president's budget, so it's very concerning. In fact, according to the White House, how the project will spur economic and social returns on investment ranks at the bottom in terms of deciding where dollars would go. It's just 5% of the formula for choosing projects versus 70% for the ability to secure non-federal funding. That's very concerning for our rural communities. And when we talk about state and local governments having resources, I wanted to also ask you about marketplace fairness or e-fairness. You told the Senate Banking Committee in January of this year that the president is supportive of the idea and looks forward to working with lawmakers on this issue. I've been working on this issue with a bipartisan group since before I was in Congress. And I ran the Department of Revenue for the state of Washington, and it's absolutely critical for state and local budgets that we resolve this issue. Yet we've had good bipartisan legislation. House leadership has refused to allow that to move. We haven't even had a committee markup. So is this a priority for the administration? And can I have your commitment that you're going to help us move forward on online fairness legislation?
This I'm actually very pleased to answer, because I will change my comment from he's supportive to he feels strongly. I have personally spoken to him about this. Without a comment on any specific bill, he does feel strongly that the taxes should be collected.
Well, we have some specific bill, very specific bill out there that is bipartisan, and we need it to move. So I would appreciate the commitment to actually make sure that moves, because this is something that's been languishing for years. Again, bipartisan legislation, and it's critical for our state and local governments. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. LaHood. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. Having just passed once-in-a-lifetime tax reform, and obviously the effect that's having on our economy is significant, and our economy continues to grow, I would hate to see us shoot ourselves in the foot by withdrawing from NAFTA. And the consequences of withdrawing from NAFTA would have significant impact on agriculture, manufacturing, lots of other things. But you know, as I look at those negotiations and where we're headed, that causes me a lot of concern, and a lot of other folks in Congress. Can you tell us the role that you play on the trade negotiations and the consequences of withdrawing from NAFTA to our economy?
Sure. So I am actively involved. Ambassador Lighthizer is leading this, but I am meeting weekly with him, with other members of the economic team. And I'm cautiously hopeful that Ambassador Lighthizer will be renegotiating this deal. So it is a major priority of ours to renegotiate the deal.
And can you talk a little bit about the consequences to the U.S. economy if we did withdraw?
I don't want to go through the consequences because, again, that's not our first priority. Our priority is to renegotiate the deal, and as I said, we are actively having discussions on this. I don't want to go into the details in this public setting, but I'd be happy to follow up with you privately.
Thank you. Look forward to following up. As a second part of trade, when the new administration came in, they talked a lot about bilateral trade agreements. So we're 14 months in now, and we haven't had a bilateral trade agreement put forth, or really even a template or kind of an example or a model for bilateral trade agreement. Can you talk a little bit about what you see in terms of bilateral trade and how important that is to our U.S. economy?
I do think it's very important. So as I said, this is one of the top issues we're meeting on constantly. The president's priority is bilateral, but I think he is open-minded. In Davos, he commented that if we could renegotiate the TPP, he would consider going into multilateral. And we are in active discussions. Again, I don't want to go through it publicly here, but I assure you we are in active discussions on enhancing our ability for exports and creating more fair trade for American companies. It's a very big focus of the president's.
Well, thank you for those comments. Obviously, I think you understand the importance of international trade, what it means to our economy moving forward, and look forward to your input on that and your advice on this administration, because it's vitally important to this country moving forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Ms. Chu, you're recognized.
Secretary Mnuchin, the GOP tax plan is terrific for the top 1% and the wealthiest of the corporations. Now, the top 1% can buy not just one mansion, but two. And corporations like Kimberly-Clark, the maker of brands such as Kleenex, Scott, and Huggies, said that the savings it receives from the new tax cut law will help them pay for a restructuring program that includes layoffs of about 5,000 to 5,500 people, or 12 to 13% of its workforce. And who is paying for this windfall? Well, in my state, it's 6.1 million California families who will immediately bear the burden thanks to limits to the state and local tax deduction. The average Californian deducts $18,000 in local taxes each year. For 100 years, a SALT deduction ensured that they wouldn't be taxed twice on their hard-earned money. But with the $10,000 cap, Californians are liable to pay taxes on $8,000 more. Already, my constituents have told me they're filled with dread when attempting to plan their family finances. These dollars hadn't been taxed because they help our state and local economies by paying for better schools, better roads, and other important services like fire and police. But by capping what can be deducted, Republicans are hollowing out our state's most essential services. And if that's not enough, Mr. Mnuchin, in an attempt to pay for these tax cuts, your administration's budget strikes another blow to California by cutting critical grants and programs that help the most at-risk populations in my state. Your budget completely eliminates programs like the Social Services Block Grant, which provides critical services to our most vulnerable, including seniors and victims of child abuse. It cuts funding of $21 billion to the Temporary Assistance for Families program, or TANF, which helps the neediest families put food on the table. It completely guts the Community Development Block Grant program and the Low Income Home Energy Assistance program, LIHEAP, which funds affordable housing projects and ensures that families don't have to pick between paying their energy bills and paying for their medicine or other bills. Mr. Mnuchin, these changes will affect over 3 million seniors, children, working parents, the disabled, and other families in my state who are struggling to make ends meet. California stands to lose over $1 billion a year based solely on the cuts to these 4 programs alone. All this, Mr. Secretary, at the same time that the Republican tax scam wants to see California turned into even more of a donor state, with our taxes rising to pay for Republicans' ill-conceived tax cut for corporations and the wealthiest few. This tax plan is irresponsible, and the budget is heartless. I yield back.
Mr. Secretary, I'd like to thank you for appearing for us today. Please be advised, members of Congress of the committee have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions, your answers, will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us. The committee stands adjourned.